Welcome back, scholars. I have truly missed you. Today's lesson is lesson 1-2.16, Monks and Nuns Save the World. Today we will be looking at the role of medieval monasteries in particular in reviving town life in the Middle Ages. It's going to be much broader than just looking at the monks and nuns, but I want you to make sure that you're highlighting their role and their influence on the revival of town and city life in medieval times. To start off, our discussion today is going to focus largely on pilgrimages. Now, a pilgrimage is a journey taken for a religious purpose. And during the Middle Ages, we would see that most feudal lords, and here I'm talking the highest feudal lords, kings would go on pilgrimages, and the lowest as well, that is down at the knight level. Pilgrimages were not common for freemen, and serfs would not be going on pilgrimages at all, unless they were going with their lords. But feudal lords frequently would go on these pilgrimages, these religious journeys. Some would do for repentance of sin, some would do to really emphasize the religious nature of their life. Now, there were many destinations, but above all other, Jerusalem was the most popular, and going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a high status symbol in Middle Ages Europe. That you had gone on that pilgrimage was a big deal. This is largely because it's expensive, and also you're going to the land of Jesus Christ. Other holy sites were also visited. There would be pilgrimage destinations throughout Europe. People would want to go to Rome, people would want to go to Canterbury, people would want to go to all these other different places as well. We're going to be focusing today largely on this Jerusalem pilgrimage, though. Now, here we see some of the main pilgrimage routes heading out to Jerusalem and the other holy lands. Pilgrims would usually travel in large groups, find out, which other feudal lords were interested in some pilgrimage. You would organize to do this together. So you would have a group of barons from, say, southern France, all taking this pilgrimage around the same time. Larger groups would provide one, company, people that you know, people that you associate with on a regular basis, and also, importantly, security, because traveling through some of these areas was not always considered the safest thing to do, although pilgrims had a special status. You were not supposed to do anything to harm a pilgrim. And this was pretty well accepted by Christians throughout Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic Empire as well. The Islamic Empire had, for most of its history, given this right of travel, this right of pilgrimage to Christians to go ahead and come to Jerusalem. Their reasons for doing so were largely economic. Pilgrims were bringing a lot of wealth into their territory, and they would spend it. But there was this acceptance of other religions as well. So these well-traveled routes, these routes that would get large groups of pilgrims year after year after year, started to attract more pilgrims, because once those routes were established, they became more comfortable and safer for all travelers. Part of the reason for this comfort is the monasteries. Okay, there's a reason why we call this Monks and Nuns Save the World. It is because the monks and nuns, particularly through their monasteries, are going to be actively encouraging pilgrims and pilgrimages. Now, they do this, actively to provide the pilgrims themselves with a place to rest. They want to encourage pilgrims to come to them, but they have their own reasons for doing this as well. The pilgrims that come and stay at these monasteries would generally be traveling with a large amount of their movable wealth, that is, their coins. And coins were very valuable, especially in a society where most transactions were done through barter. You get stacks of wheat as payment, and the monasteries couldn't always, buy anything with that wheat, and it would go to spoil. Well, coins never spoil. So you get a large number of pilgrims coming through. They're going to be giving gifts to these monasteries that they're staying at in coins, which are a durable source of wealth. So the monasteries can start to build up a more permanent base of wealth. Now, in most cases, the monasteries were stopping points, but some of them over time become destinations in and of themselves. They have the relics of saints. These are the remains of saints or important aspects of the saint's life, which themselves can draw Christian followers in who want to see this stuff or believe that these relics hold special powers. They want to see these relics. Now, this makes some of those monasteries a destination, more wealth coming into the monasteries. And the wealth of these pilgrims really does add to the wealth of the monasteries themselves. Now, these monasteries aren't just going to lock up that wealth. They're going to spend it. They're going to spend it on building projects. They're going to spend it on sometimes public service projects. And in a few cases, you actually see the corruption of monasteries because of this wealth. You start to see monks dressing in much nicer clothing and eating much nicer meals. They're not really supposed to be doing that, but wealth tends to corrupt. But that's the role of the monasteries. The monasteries really do encourage these pilgrimages. Now, the economics of pilgrimages goes beyond simply the benefits to those monks and those monasteries, because the wealth that traveled with the pilgrims is not just going to go to them. It will largely go to them at first, but the monks and the monasteries then spending that wealth is going to help to develop a larger trade class. The monasteries are getting wealthy, but local tradesmen are also benefiting. When a monastery gets wealthy, they decide to expand. Local tradesmen are going to be hired to do a lot of that work. And those tradesmen are going to build skills, build a little bit of wealth for themselves, and you start to get the development of more skilled class. This was such a case that monasteries are competing for the traffic of pilgrims. The more pilgrims come through, the more wealth they get, the larger they can build their monasteries, the more prestige they get, and the more pilgrims will come. So it's a really good system for these monasteries. It's a really good system for the tradesmen that live around those monasteries. Now, the growth of trade is going to be something that we touch on now, and we're going to be circling back into during our unit on the Crusades as well. The lords who are returning from pilgrimages, either to Byzantium or to the Islamic lands, and most pilgrims would go through Byzantium if they were taking a land route to Jerusalem. But in both cases, they're coming back and they're just talking about how unbelievably wealthy these nations are. See, these Western European lords are very wealthy compared to their serfs. And some are even wealthy compared to each other. But they are nowhere near as wealthy as these emperors of Byzantium. And the Islamic lands make even Byzantium, by comparison, sometimes look poor. These are areas that are, well, the Islamic Empire in particular, are in a golden age. Their culture is flourishing. Their trade is flourishing. They are insanely wealthy compared to Europe of the time. And these European lords who think that they're a big deal are going down and they're meeting all these guys. They're saying, wait a minute, these guys are the really wealthy ones. They eat luxurious foods every meal. They're decorated in the finest cloth, silks from China. They've got jeweled everything. I want some more of that. And they bring some back with them. They spend a lot of their wealth getting some of these luxuries. And these tradesmen who are sitting in these monastic communities are starting to recognize all this wealth coming back. They're saying, hey, there's a market here. European lords and wealthy people in Europe want this. So the tradesmen realize that they can start using the pilgrim routes to bring trade goods to Europe. And we start to see market fairs. Along the pilgrimage routes, especially near these monasteries, market fairs become common. These are not permanent settlements, but for a period of time, during the year, sometimes a few times a year, traders would travel to these market towns knowing that they could exchange goods. And we find out that some European goods, especially wine and wool, were highly desired in the East. So where in Europe they were more common and less desirable, in the East they were less common and more desirable. There was no good source of wool compared to, say, English wool or wool coming out of the north of France. There's nothing comparable in the Middle East. And so these are highly sought after, and we start to see an increased exchange of goods, first through these market fairs, but then a little bit later on, we see the growth of towns and more permanent bases for trade. Now, the market fair is going to stick around for a very, very long time, okay? It's going to be specific times during the year where all these traders come together. But increasingly, some traders and merchants are setting up permanent homes in these market fairs, and they're becoming market towns where people are living on a year-round basis and needing year-round services. So you see the establishment of inns. You see the start of kind of rudimentary restaurants. So we wouldn't think of these as restaurants in the terms today, but they were areas that provided cooked meals for travelers. And soon towns are dotting this pilgrimage route, and a true middle class is starting to develop. We start to see people who are acquiring wealth separate from owning huge feudal estates, separate from the feudal landowners. You start to see merchants with as much wealth as barons. And this is our middle class. They are not nobility, they have no titles, but they do have wealth. And to tie this back into monks and nuns, just remember that it was the monasteries and their role in encouraging pilgrimages, making pilgrimages more comfortable, and starting this process of developing this trade class that would then participate in this trade with the Islamic Empire that really gets this thing going. And where we start with just the monasteries, pretty soon we have the growth of towns. And it's going to be the growth of towns that eventually breaks us out of the feudal system and carries us beyond the Middle Ages. I'm getting about 300 years ahead of myself there, but just know towns, as they grow and develop, are going to be playing an increasing role in our story. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in class.